When did you know a student wouldn't walk out of your classroom alive? Samir fell out of his chair behind me and started clutching his nose as blood poured between his fingers. The entire class gasped as he tried to speak through the blood flowing down his chin. Something in my lunch. Then his eyes rolled back and he collapsed onto the floor. His body went limp and more blood pooled around his head from his nose. I dropped the marker and rushed to his side and yelled for someone to get help. Before I could check his pulse, a guy named Luca Olsen jumped up from his seat in the back row. He pushed through the crowd of students and screamed, "Wait! Don't move him! I know what's wrong with him. I'll be back." He sprinted out of the classroom before I could stop him. I called the office and told them to send the nurse immediately and call 911. Mrs. Schroeder arrived within minutes carrying her medical bag. She checked Samir's pulse and her face went pale. She announced his heartbeat was dangerously slow and getting weaker. Without hesitation, she pointed at Valerie, the captain of the swim team, and told her to start chest compressions to the beat of "Staying Alive." Valerie positioned herself and began compressions while the rest of the class formed a circle around them. Many were crying or holding each other. I kept checking the door for paramedics while Mrs. Schroeder monitored Samir's vital signs. After 2 minutes, she checked his breathing and shook her head. She tilted his head back and gave him 2 rescue breaths. His chest rose and fell, but he remained unresponsive. Valerie resumed compressions, sweat dripping down her face from the effort. The class watched helplessly as their classmate's lips turned blue, and his skin took on a grayish tone. Mrs. Schroeder pulled out a penlight and lifted Samir's eyelids one at a time. The left pupil contracted normally, but the right remained fixed and dilated. She looked up with a mix of relief and concern, saying he was alive but barely. She instructed students to elevate his legs to keep blood flowing to his brain. 10 agonizing minutes passed before Luca burst back through the door. He was breathing hard and had garbage stains on his clothes from diving through trash cans. In his hands was a cafeteria tray with a half-eaten sandwich and apple core. Everyone turned to stare as he set it on a nearby desk. "I found his lunch. Look at the sandwich." We gathered around while 2 students continued CPR on Samir. The sandwich had 2 bites taken out of it, and between the bread and turkey was a layer of something black. Not mold or rot, but a deliberately spread substance that looked like tar. It had a chemical sheen and had partially absorbed into the bread. Luca carefully pulled the sandwich apart, revealing more of the black paste. Some had mixed with the mayo, creating gray streaks. The smell was faintly chemical, making several students back away. Mrs. Schroeder grabbed it and immediately told everyone not to touch it before calling poison control. The paramedics finally arrived as she was describing the substance. They took over CPR and started an IV while one bagged the sandwich as evidence. I heard them radio about a possible poisoning case and mention preparing decontamination procedures. The whole class watched as they wheeled Samir out on a stretcher. Police arrived shortly after and sealed off Samir's desk. They interviewed students who'd been sitting nearby and took the rest of the lunch tray as evidence. Luca explained finding it in the cafeteria dumpster, after remembering Samir had thrown it away after only a few bites. As the officers questioned us, I noticed them paying special attention to who had access to Samir's lunch. They asked about his friends, enemies, and daily routine. The cafeteria would be shut down pending investigation, and all food service areas would be searched. This wasn't food poisoning or an allergic reaction. Detective Giles pulled me aside and showed me a text they'd found on Samir's phone from an unknown number sent that morning. "Enjoy your lunch today. Consider it payback for what you did to my sister." The detective explained they'd traced the number to a burner phone purchased with cash, but security footage from the store showed a young man in a hoodie who looked familiar. As she showed me the grainy image, I realized with growing horror that I recognized the build and posture. "Mrs. Branson," the detective said quietly, "we need to talk about Luca Olsen. He found that sandwich awfully fast, didn't he?" I looked at the detective and felt my stomach twist into a knot because I'd been thinking the exact same thing. "I need to look at that footage again more carefully," I told her while rubbing my temples. She nodded and made a note on her pad before the principal's voice came over the intercom calling all faculty to the conference room immediately. I rushed down the hallway with other teachers and found Ronald Weber standing at the front of the room with his arms crossed. The principal stood beside him looking pale and kept checking his phone every few seconds. "Listen carefully," the principal said once everyone sat down. "Nobody talks to the media about what happened today." Ronald Weber stepped forward and pointed at each of us in turn. The school could face massive lawsuits if anyone says the wrong thing to reporters. He explained that all questions should go through his office and reminded us 3 times about liability issues. After the meeting ended, I caught Detective Giles in the hallway and pulled her aside near the water fountain. "That person in the hoodie buying the phone," I said quietly. "They had this specific slouch and head tilt I've seen before." She pulled out her notebook and asked me to write down everyone I could think of who moved that way. I started making a list but kept getting distracted by the image of that grainy security footage. That evening at home, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my laptop while my dinner got cold. My mind kept replaying the morning over and over like a broken record. Samir had thrown his lunch away so fast, way faster than normal. He usually sat there eating slowly while reading his chemistry textbook, but today he'd taken 2 bites and tossed the whole tray. My email notification kept pinging and I opened my inbox to find dozens of messages from parents. Some were angry and demanding answers about school safety while others were scared for their kids. A few mentioned hearing rumors about some girl at another school that Samir had supposedly hurt last year. One parent said her daughter was too scared to come to the school tomorrow. Another threatened to pull their kid out completely if we didn't have better security. My phone rang and Ronald Weber's name appeared on the screen. "You need to write a statement for the district lawyers by tomorrow morning," he said without even saying hello. He reminded me to stick to facts only and avoid any speculation about who might be responsible. "Just the facts," he repeated. "Nothing about suspects or theories." He said it 3 more times before hanging up. I spent hours typing and deleting sentences, trying to describe what happened without saying too much. The next morning, I got to the school early and saw Orange Health Department notices taped all over the cafeteria doors. Pia Melendez stood there arguing with 2 inspectors in white coats who kept shaking their heads. "My kitchen staff had nothing to do with this," she kept saying while waving her hands. "The inspectors just wrote things on their clipboards and took photos of everything." I walked past them to my classroom and stopped in the doorway when I saw the yellow police tape around Samir's desk. The janitors hadn't been allowed to clean yet, and I could still smell that faint metallic scent of blood. My legs felt weak and I had to grab the doorframe to steady myself. The memory of him collapsing hit me all at once and I sank into my chair. Everything looked the same but felt completely different. The desks were still arranged in rows and my whiteboard still had yesterday's lesson half written. But that empty desk with the tape made the whole room feel wrong. Pia found me there an hour later and knocked softly on the doorframe. "Can we talk?" she asked, and came in without waiting for an answer. She explained that once students get their lunch trays and leave the serving line, nobody monitors them. "They could go anywhere in the building," she said while pacing back and forth. "Someone could have easily switched that sandwich between the cafeteria and your classroom." She showed me the layout of the building on her phone and pointed out all the blind spots. The hallway by the gym, the stairwell near the library, even the alcove by the water fountains. Any of those places would work for someone wanting to swap food without being seen. By lunchtime, word had spread through the whole school that Luca was questioned again by police. I saw students stepping aside when he walked down the hall and heard whispers following him everywhere. He knew exactly where to look, one girl said to her friend by the lockers. "Nobody finds evidence that fast unless they put it there," another student muttered. Luca kept his head down and walked faster, his shoulders hunched up around his ears. Some kids actually turned and went the other way when they saw him coming. The rumors were spreading faster than the truth, and I could see him breaking under the weight of everyone's suspicion. Even teachers were looking at him differently now, their eyes following him with doubt. Detective Giles found me after school and pulled out her phone to show me another photo from the store's security camera. This one was clearer and taken from outside when the person was leaving. She pointed at the navy hoodie and asked if I recognized it. My stomach sank when I saw our school mascot printed on the back. Half the kids at our school owned that exact same hoodie from the school store. The detective watched my face and nodded like she already knew what I was thinking. She put her phone away and said she'd be checking with the school store for purchase records. Students kept coming up to me in the hallway between classes asking if Samir was going to be okay. I could only shake my head and tell them I didn't know anything. The administration had sent out an email that morning telling all staff not to share any medical updates about Samir, even if we somehow got them. Parents were calling the school nonstop, and Ronald had his secretary screening everything. During lunch, a student named Adriel showed me his phone with a screenshot from some group chat. The messages were from last semester, and they were talking about Samir paying someone to keep quiet about something. The texts were vague, but one person mentioned that whatever Samir did was bad enough to get him expelled if it came out. Adriel said he got it from his girlfriend who got it from someone else, so nobody knew who originally sent it. I took a photo of his screen before he walked away. Ronald Weber called me to his office right after 6th period and closed the door behind me. He sat behind his desk and folded his hands while telling me the school's reputation was at stake. He kept repeating that containing this situation had to be our top priority. Then he leaned forward and asked if I'd noticed any teachers or staff members acting strangely lately. I told him everyone was acting strange because a student almost died in my classroom. He didn't like that answer and reminded me that my contract was up for renewal next year. I left his office feeling sick. On my way to the parking lot, I ran into Luca by the gym doors. He looked exhausted with dark circles under his eyes and his shoulders slumped. He stopped when he saw me and said he hadn't slept since yesterday. He explained again that he only ran for the lunch tray because he saw Samir's reaction and remembered seeing him throw something away during lunch. He said people were calling him a killer online, and his parents were thinking about pulling him out of school. I wanted to say something helpful but couldn't think of anything that wouldn't sound empty. When I got home, I found an email from Pia with a staff memo attached. The memo showed that the cafeteria's back door had been propped open during lunch for a delivery that was running late. She'd highlighted the part that said the door was unsupervised for almost 40 minutes. That meant someone from outside could have walked in without going through the main entrance or being seen by the security cameras. She'd added a note at the bottom asking me to call her when I could. During my free period the next day, I stayed in my empty classroom and spread out the seating chart on my desk. I started marking where everyone sat and realized there were several blind spots where someone could have messed with Samir's stuff. The trash can was positioned right next to his row, and if someone crouched down there, they'd be hidden from most of the class. His backpack would have been on the floor right there, too. The more I looked at it, the more places I found where someone could have switched his sandwich without being noticed. My phone rang that afternoon and Detective Giles's number showed up. She told me Samir was still in the ICU but stable for now. The doctors were monitoring his heart and running more tests. She said his family didn't want any visitors and had asked for complete privacy during this time. She also mentioned that the lab results were coming in soon, and she'd update me when she knew more. 2 days later, she called again with the lab report. The black substance contained petroleum-based compounds mixed with crushed prescription medications. She listed off the chemicals they found and said this wasn't some random prank or accident. Someone had deliberately mixed these substances knowing they would cause serious harm. The combination was designed to be absorbed quickly through the stomach lining. She said they were treating this as attempted murder now. I met with Pia in her office behind the cafeteria that Friday. She had a clipboard with lists of names and was going through them one by one. She showed me everyone who had access to cleaning supplies and solvents near the food service areas. The list included maintenance staff, delivery drivers, and about a dozen student workers who helped during lunch. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. She'd already given copies to the police but wanted me to look in case any names stood out. One section showed temporary workers and delivery people who weren't regular employees. She said those were the hardest to track because they came and went without much oversight. After looking through the list for 20 minutes, the counselor knocked on Pia's door and asked to speak with me privately. We walked to her small office down the hall where she closed the door and pulled out a thick folder from her locked cabinet. She flipped through several pages before stopping at a document with Samir's name at the top and told me there was something I needed to know about last semester. A female student from another school had filed a complaint against him after a party, but the case was dropped when no one could prove what happened. The girl's parents were furious and kept calling the school demanding action, even though there wasn't enough evidence to do anything. She said the family had been extremely upset about the whole situation. I left her office feeling sick and headed to find Luca, who was sitting alone in the library staring at his phone. When I sat down across from him, he looked up with red eyes and immediately started talking about the security footage Detective Giles had shown him. He admitted he owned the exact same navy hoodie that the person was wearing in the store video. But then he pulled out his phone and showed me photos from his mom's Instagram that morning with timestamps proving he was at a doctor's appointment across town when the burner phone was purchased. The relief on his face when I told him I believed him was obvious. My phone buzzed with a district email marked urgent, and I opened it to find a message from the superintendent's office saying all media requests had to go through Ronald Weber immediately. They were trying to control the story, but I could already see students posting about it everywhere on social media, and the rumors were spreading faster than anyone could manage. That night around 11, I was grading papers when a direct message popped up on my laptop from a student whose username I didn't recognize. They said they'd seen someone in a courier uniform hanging around the cafeteria's back door that morning before school started, and the person had been looking for something specific near the dumpsters. The message disappeared after I read it, and I couldn't find any trace of who sent it. Early the next morning, Detective Giles called while I was making coffee and told me the lab had found traces of shoe polish solvent mixed with beta blockers and antihistamines in the black substance. She explained this exact combination would cause the symptoms Samir showed, including the slow heartbeat and breathing problems. The shoe polish would have masked the taste of the medications while making the whole thing absorb faster through his stomach. I grabbed a notepad and started making a list of everyone who knew Samir's lunch routine well enough to plan this. He always brought turkey sandwiches on B-schedule days, which meant only people familiar with his daily habits would know exactly when to strike. The pattern was so specific that it narrowed down the suspects to people who saw him regularly. I remembered Pia mentioning something about the door lock and went back to check her files where I found a work order from last week. The cafeteria's back door lock had been broken for 7 days, but the repairs kept getting delayed because of budget issues. Pia had complained 3 times about the security risk, but no one listened until now. She was frustrated that her concerns weren't taken seriously when she'd been warning them about this exact problem. 2 days later, Beckett Reyes stayed after class and waited until everyone else left before approaching my desk. He whispered that he needed to tell me something important, but was scared of getting involved. He'd seen someone swap a sandwich at the end of lunch period near the trash cans by the exit. The person had been wearing dark clothes and moved quickly, but Beckett noticed them take something from a bag and switch it with another sandwich on a tray. He was terrified of what might happen if anyone found out he was talking, but felt too guilty to stay quiet any longer. When I asked him to describe anything else he remembered, Beckett pulled out a piece of paper where he'd drawn a sketch. The person had been wearing a distinctive college championship ring on their right hand, with a logo that looked familiar, but I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. The ring had a large stone in the center with text around it, and what looked like a mascot design on the side. He said the person's hand had been shaking slightly when they made the switch. I took the sketch to Pia, who had been going through delivery logs all morning, and she showed me something strange in the records. There was an unscheduled drop-off around lunchtime from a driver who wasn't on the regular route for that day. The signature on the form was just a messy scribble, and the package description section was completely blank, which never happened with legitimate deliveries. The timestamp showed it happened right before lunch started, which would have given someone perfect access to the cafeteria area. Pia said she'd never seen this driver before, and none of the regular staff recognized the name on the log. The whole thing felt wrong, and we both knew this wasn't just some random delivery mix-up, but part of something planned. Ronald Weber was waiting for me outside my classroom the next morning with his arms crossed and that look he gets when he's about to lecture someone. He pulled me into an empty conference room and shut the door hard enough that the blinds rattled against the window. He started pacing back and forth while telling me the district was getting nervous about liability issues with me asking so many questions. His face got redder as he talked about how I needed to let the police handle their job and stop playing detective before I created legal problems for everyone. He slammed his hand on the table and said if I kept investigating on my own, he'd have no choice but to put me on administrative leave immediately. I nodded and left, but went straight to my computer where an email from the cafeteria vendor was waiting in my inbox about their delivery schedules. The message mentioned they'd had a temporary courier named James covering routes all week, but nobody seemed to have his full contact info on file. The vendor said James had been hired through a temp agency, and they were still trying to track down his background check paperwork from their files. I printed the email and walked down the hall to find Luca sitting alone in the library with his head in his hands looking exhausted. When I asked him where he'd been during lunch period yesterday, he pulled out his phone and showed me messages from the robotics club advisor. The timestamps proved he'd been helping set up equipment in the lab during the exact time someone would have switched the sandwiches in the cafeteria. He scrolled through photos showing him carrying circuit boards and soldering irons with other club members visible in the background working on their projects. Relief washed over his face when I told him this was good proof, but then his shoulders slumped again as he talked about the looks he was getting. My phone buzzed with a call from the hospital saying they had an update on Samir's condition that the family wanted shared with the school. The nurse explained that Samir had briefly needed a ventilator when his breathing got too shallow, but was now breathing on his own again. They were still running tests to identify all the substances in his system and figure out if there would be any long-term effects from the poisoning. She said his heart rate was stable now, but they'd be monitoring him closely for at least another week before considering discharge to home care. I found Pia by the loading dock after school where delivery trucks were pulling in with tomorrow's food shipments for the cafeteria. She looked guilty as she admitted she sometimes props the back door open herself when deliveries run late and she needs quick access. The delivery schedule was so tight that following all the security protocols would mean food wouldn't be ready in time for lunch service. She showed me the clipboard with delivery times and I could see there was barely 5 minutes between trucks arriving and needing to be unloaded. Her hands shook as she explained how she'd been doing this for months, without thinking it could be a security risk until now. An official notice from the district's legal team was waiting in my mailbox when I got back to my classroom that afternoon. The letter stated that Samir's family was considering civil action against the school for failing to provide adequate security and supervision. Everyone was instructed to preserve all documents and communications related to the incident, including emails, notes, and any informal conversations about the poisoning. The lawyers wanted everything documented in case depositions were needed, and warned us not to delete anything that might be considered evidence later. Beckett stayed after class again the next day, and waited until we were alone before telling me his sister went to another school nearby. She knew the girl from the rumors about Samir, and had heard there was a video that circulated briefly before being deleted from phones. Nobody had saved proof of what happened, but multiple students remembered seeing it and talking about how bad it looked for Samir's reputation. Beckett's sister said the girl's family had been furious when the school wouldn't take action without concrete evidence of what Samir had supposedly done. Detective Giles called that evening to share that their analysis of the hoodie buyer's walk from the security footage was inconclusive after all. The height and build could match multiple students at our school, or even a young staff member who might have access to the building. She sounded frustrated as she explained how the person had kept their head down and walked in a way that made identification nearly impossible. The tech team had tried enhancing the footage, but the quality was too poor to get any distinguishing features beyond general body type and gait. Luca showed up at my classroom door after school looking worse than I'd ever seen him, with dark circles under his eyes and unwashed hair. He broke down crying as he talked about how everyone assumed he was guilty just because he'd found the evidence so quickly. His voice cracked when he said he was just trying to help, and now his college applications might be ruined by being associated with this. Other students were avoiding him in the halls, and someone had written poisoner on his locker in permanent marker that maintenance couldn't fully remove. He showed me screenshots of messages calling him a wannabe killer and saying he should be expelled even without proof of guilt. The lab finally sent their full report confirming the presence of propranolol at dangerous levels mixed into the black substance on the sandwich. The amount was definitely enough to cause severe cardiac symptoms, and could have been fatal if medical help hadn't arrived when it did. I pulled Detective Giles aside after reading the lab report and pointed out that whoever did this had to get the sandwich to Samir somehow. She nodded and said they were already pulling traffic cam footage from all the delivery trucks that came near the school that morning. The tech team was going through hours of video looking for any courier vans or trucks that stopped near our building between 7 and noon. She showed me printouts of vehicle plates they'd captured so far and asked if any looked familiar from my morning arrival. I recognized a few regular delivery companies, but nothing stood out as unusual. She made notes about each one I remembered seeing before and said they'd cross-reference with the company's official routes for that day. 2 days later, she called with news that made my stomach drop. A contractor's employee roster from a local courier service showed they'd hired someone named James Hartley just 2 weeks ago for temporary delivery routes around our district. His emergency contact form listed a sister who went to Roosevelt High, the school just 15 minutes from ours. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence since he'd started right before the poisoning happened. Detective Giles said she was heading to his apartment that afternoon to question him and would update me after. She called me that evening and her voice was tight with excitement. Hartley had answered the door wearing a college championship ring that matched exactly what Beckett had described down to the logo and year engraved on it. When she asked about his deliveries to our school, he claimed he only made drops to the loading dock and never went inside the building itself. He said he left packages with whoever was working the dock that day and got signatures on his electronic pad before leaving. She pressed him about the morning of the poisoning, and he stuck to his story about staying outside the whole time. But she noticed he kept touching the ring nervously whenever she mentioned Samir's name or asked about the cafeteria access. The next morning brought more evidence when the tech team finished analyzing phone tower data from the burner phone. The pings showed it moving along Hartley's exact delivery route that morning, hitting towers near each of his scheduled stops. Later that same day, it pinged at a strip mall where credit card records showed Hartley had bought lunch during his break. The timeline was matching up too perfectly for this to be someone else using the same route by chance. Detective Giles said they needed just a bit more evidence before they could arrest him. That same afternoon, I found out through an email from Ronald Weber that Luca had been suspended pending the investigation's outcome, even though there wasn't any real evidence against him. The email said it was for his own safety and the safety of other students, but I knew it was really about protecting the school from liability. I checked social media that night and wanted to throw my phone across the room. Students were posting horrible things about Luca, calling him a wannabe killer and saying he should be expelled or worse. Someone had started a petition to ban him from graduation, and it already had over 200 signatures. The comments under his old Instagram posts were brutal, with people saying they always knew something was off about him. His mom had posted asking people to stop harassing her son, and someone had responded by posting her work address. I screenshot everything to send to Detective Giles as evidence of how badly this was affecting an innocent kid. Beckett came to my classroom before school the next day looking pale and shaky. He'd given his formal statement to police the night before, describing the ring and courier uniform in detail for the official record. The detective had recorded everything and had him sign multiple forms confirming his testimony was true. He told me the school counselor had put him in some kind of safety plan because he was scared someone might come after him for speaking up. They'd changed his schedule so he could leave through different exits and avoid the main hallways between classes. His parents were thinking about pulling him out for the rest of the year if things got worse. That afternoon, Pia found me in the teacher's lounge and mentioned something that made everything click. She remembered a delivery guy matching Hartley's description had asked her for directions to the service entrance 2 days before Samir got poisoned. She hadn't thought anything of it at the time since new drivers often got confused by our building's layout, but now she realized he'd been scoping out the entrances and learning where he could get in without being noticed. She'd already called Detective Giles to add this to her statement. The arrest happened that evening when police searched Hartley's car with a warrant. They found a container of shoe polish in his trunk, along with a prescription bottle of propranolol that had someone else's name scratched off the label. The tech team pulled data from the burner phone they'd recovered, and the text messages matched word for word with the threats Samir had received that morning. There were other texts, too. Angry rants about his sister and how the school had failed her. Detective Giles called to tell me they had enough for attempted murder charges. The next morning, I stormed into Ronald Weber's office without knocking and told him Luca's suspension needed to be lifted immediately. I showed him the arrest report and said if he didn't clear Luca's name right now, I'd go to the school board myself and tell them how he'd suspended an innocent student to cover the school's ass. He tried to argue about procedures and investigations, but I cut him off and said the evidence was clear that Hartley did it, not Luca. I threatened to call the local news and tell them about a student being punished without any evidence while the real criminal was already in custody. Weber's face went red, but he picked up his phone and called someone about reversing the suspension immediately. Later that day, Detective Giles called with the final piece of the puzzle. Hartley had confessed during interrogation that his sister was the girl who'd filed the complaint against Samir last year at Roosevelt High. When the school didn't do anything because there wasn't enough evidence, he decided to take matters into his own hands to make Samir understand what real fear felt like. He'd been planning it for weeks, getting the job at the courier company specifically to access our school, and studying Samir's routine until he knew exactly when and where to make the switch. The hospital called the next morning with an update that made my stomach drop. Samir was finally off the ventilator, but the doctors said he'd need weeks of cardiac monitoring and might have cognitive effects from the oxygen deprivation during those critical minutes. His mom sent another email saying his recovery would be long and complicated with physical therapy and regular brain scans to check for damage. I spent my lunch period looking for Luca and found him sitting alone in the library corner where nobody else ever went. His backpack had new graffiti on it, and someone had scratched something nasty into his locker that morning. I sat down across from him and apologized for doubting him, even if I never said it out loud. He looked up from his book and said he knew people would always wonder if he was somehow involved no matter what the evidence showed. His college acceptance letters were sitting on the table, and I noticed he'd crossed out 3 schools already. Weber called me to his office that afternoon and told me he was lifting Luca's suspension, but wouldn't make any public statement about clearing his name. He kept tapping his pen on his desk while explaining that formally accusing him, then retracting it, could open the school to defamation lawsuits. The paperwork would just say the suspension was reversed due to new information in the investigation. No apology, no acknowledgement of the mistake, just bureaucratic language that protected the school's liability. Pia caught me in the hallway later and showed me the new protocols she'd already started implementing. Every delivery driver would now have to check in at the main office and wear a bright orange visitor badge that couldn't be hidden. She'd also installed new locks on all the service doors that couldn't be propped open anymore. The maintenance guys were complaining about having to use their keycards every single time, but she didn't care. She walked me around to show where she'd put chains on the dumpster lids too, so nobody could dig through them looking for evidence or planting something. Detective Giles called that evening to tell me Hartley would face attempted murder charges. But there was a problem. His sister refused to participate in the case at all, and just wanted to move on with her life without more trauma. Without her testimony about what happened with Samir last year, the motive would be harder to prove in court. The detective sounded frustrated but said they had enough physical evidence to proceed anyway. I spent that night thinking about how fast the rumors had spread and poisoned Luca's reputation before we knew anything. The group chats and social media posts had convicted him within hours based on nothing but suspicion. I decided I needed to address this with my students when classes resumed the next week. We arranged the desks in a circle for our first class back, and I told everyone we could express our fears and anger without naming any suspects or victims. Many students were struggling with feeling unsafe in a place they'd always thought was secure. Some cried while talking about watching Samir almost die on our classroom floor. Others admitted they didn't trust the cafeteria food anymore and were bringing sealed lunches from home. A few mentioned their parents wanted to transfer them to private schools. Luca raised his hand halfway through and explained that he'd noticed something was off about the sandwich, because the black substance was visible from the side when Samir set it down. He'd remembered seeing Samir throw it away unusually fast, and that's what made him run to check the dumpster. The other students finally started seeing him as observant instead of suspicious. Several apologized for the things they'd posted online about him. After class, I asked Beckett to stay behind and thanked him privately for his courage in coming forward with what he saw. His hands were shaking less now, but he still looked over his shoulder constantly. The counselor had arranged for him to have extra support sessions without making him feel singled out from other students. His parents had decided not to pull him from the school after all since Hartley was in custody. Pia gave me a tour that afternoon of all the new safety measures she'd rushed to install. Door alarms would sound if any service entrance was held open more than 30 seconds. Security cameras now covered every blind spot in the cafeteria and loading areas. She'd mapped out every possible entry point and made sure each one was monitored or secured. She showed me the new sign-in system for all food deliveries with photographs of each driver and timestamps for every entrance and exit. The metal detectors at the main entrance were being upgraded too. It was reassuring to see all these changes, but sad that it took Samir nearly dying to get the district to approve the funding. Parents were still calling demanding more information, and the school board had scheduled 3 emergency meetings already. Everyone wanted someone to blame beyond just Hartley, like the system itself had failed to protect students. The truth was they were right, but nobody wanted to admit how many warning signs we'd missed. Ronald sent out an email that afternoon with the subject line, "Important Safety Update," that basically said nothing. He used words like enhanced protocols and comprehensive review without mentioning the poisoning or James or anything real. I read it 3 times trying to find actual information, but it was all empty corporate language designed to avoid lawsuits. The other teachers were passing copies around in the break room and shaking their heads at how useless it was. Parents started calling the school within minutes, demanding real answers, but the office staff could only repeat the same vague talking points Ronald had given them. That evening, I found an email from an address I didn't recognize in my inbox. When I opened it, I saw it was from Samir's mother thanking me for calling 911 so fast and staying with him until help arrived. She wrote that the doctors said those first few minutes made the difference between him surviving or not. She didn't ask any questions about what happened or mention the investigation or anything about James. Just a simple thank you that made me cry at my desk. The next morning, our class decided to do something for Mrs. Schroeder since she'd basically saved Samir's life with her quick medical response. Someone suggested a poster and everyone got excited about the idea. We spent the whole period working on it with students drawing hearts and writing messages about how brave she was. Even the kids who usually sat in the back and never participated were adding their signatures and little drawings. I carried the poster to her office after school and knocked on her door. She was sitting at her desk surrounded by medical journals and looked tired. When she saw the poster, her eyes got watery and she stood up to look at all the signatures. We didn't say much, but stood there for a minute, both thinking about that awful morning when Samir almost died on our classroom floor. 3 months passed before Samir came back to the school. I saw him walking down the hallway with a small device attached to his chest under his shirt. The cardiac monitor beeped occasionally, and he had to leave class early twice a week for medical appointments. Students gave him space without making it weird, and teachers didn't call on him unless he raised his hand. Slowly, things started feeling less tense, and people stopped whispering when he walked by. His friends sat with him at lunch again, and I even heard him laughing in the hallway one afternoon. Luca found me after school one day holding an acceptance letter from the engineering program he'd been dreaming about since freshman year. He told me the whole experience with the investigation taught him to document everything, and always stand up for what's right even when people doubt you. Most of the students had stopped treating him like a suspect, and some even told him they respected how fast he'd acted that day. His reputation wasn't completely fixed, but it was getting better week by week. Beckett had changed too since giving his testimony to the police. He walked with more confidence and stopped looking over his shoulder all the time. When Pia announced she was starting a student safety committee to help prevent future incidents, Beckett was the first to sign up. He told me he wanted to make sure no other student had to witness what he saw or be afraid to speak up about something wrong. The committee met every Tuesday and worked on proposals for better security cameras and emergency procedures. News came through the district email that James had accepted a plea deal for 10 years with the possibility of parole in 6. The prosecutor had wanted to go to trial, but James's lawyer convinced him to take the deal to avoid a longer sentence. His sister had already transferred to online school to escape all the attention and gossip about her brother being a poisoner. The detective told me privately that the sister still refused to talk about what happened with Samir the year before, and just wanted to disappear. At least the cycle of revenge had finally stopped, even if the damage couldn't be undone. 6 months after that terrifying morning when Samir collapsed, our class had found its rhythm again. The new safety measures were just part of daily life now, with everyone signing in at the office, and the sealed food containers in the cafeteria. Students had formed stronger friendships after going through something so scary together. Teachers checked on each other more, and parents actually showed up to PTA meetings. We'd learned the hard way that protecting each other mattered more than gossip or old grudges. The metal detectors and security cameras couldn't prevent everything, but at least people were paying attention now. Samir was back to getting good grades, and Luca was preparing for college. Beckett's safety committee had gotten 3 of their proposals approved by the school board. Even Ronald had started actually listening when teachers raised concerns, instead of just worrying about liability. We weren't the same school we'd been before the poisoning, but maybe we were better in some ways. We'd survived something terrible and come out knowing that looking out for each other wasn't just nice to do, but necessary for everyone's survival. That's where we'll close today. Thanks for being here. It honestly makes these stories so much more meaningful. Subscribe and let's keep the good vibes going.